You're listening to Beyond the Sermon, the podcast of First Methodist Church in Collingswood, New Jersey. On our podcast, the goal is not just to share our sermons, but to go beyond the sermon and talk about what we're learning and what God is doing in us and in our community. The conversation you're about to join was inspired by our Fall 2023 sermon series, In the Wilderness. In this sermon series, we're walking with the Israelites from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land and looking at what we can learn about trusting God more, even when the journey looks different than we anticipated or expected. You can find more information about our church at fumccollingswood.org. Thanks for joining us for this conversation.
Before the services even started, we do our weekly gathering of the tech team, the worship team, and
we run through the service and then pray.
I mentioned, well, if anyone wants to know your sermon, just look on your whiteboard in your office. And you're like, well, that's not really all of it. And so I'm curious, what was the shift between what's on your board and what ended up getting preached?
Oh, good question. So the way my week kind of goes is
sleep, do whatever you want, Saturday cram.
Right, because pastors only work on Sunday.
Yeah.
So, so Sunday is kind of the big day with all the services and the preaching and all that stuff. And then Monday, we come in, we record the podcast at some point. There's usually some follow-up stuff I want to do because of stuff that I heard on Sunday or information that's come in, questions, that kind of stuff. And so Monday kind of wraps up my week. And Tuesday, I begin to shift my focus toward the next week. And so often on Tuesday, I will sit down, open up my Bible, and get out a dry erase marker and just start working through the passage that I felt led to preach from this week when I was developing the sermon series. And I'll just start making notes about where I think I might be going or things that stick out to me, things the Spirit seems to be drawing some attention to. And that's what goes up on the whiteboard. And then I kind of stare at that as I'm thinking about things over the next few days while I'm preparing stuff for committee meetings and having other conversations with people one-on-one or in small groups or whatever until, either Thursday, if I get to it in time, or Saturday, when I sit down to actually kind of write out my notes and thoughts for the sermon. And all this week, I kind of had in my head that the focus of this message was going to be on trusting God as the one who made the promise. And that sometimes when God has made a promise, we still run into challenges. And so God had promised to Abraham that he was going to bring his descendants back to the land of Canaan. And God had promised to Abraham, or to Moses, that he was going to use him to bring the people up out of Egypt into the promised land. And this is kind of the climax point of that, right? And so that's kind of where I was thinking all week long until I started to sit down and actually write. I was like, this doesn't seem to be coming together. And then for whatever reason, I'm going to say the Holy Spirit, I thought about that phrase that my mom always said, delayed obedience is disobedience. And it all kind of seemed to click together, and I was able to just sit down and write out the sermon and make my notes, and there we go. You got what you got on Sunday morning. Now,
what some people got out of Sunday morning was the impending doom that loomed over you and Meg's relationship early on due to your sport affiliations. And so can you tell us about what happened and how you got past it?
Meg and I started to get to know each other in the fall of 2003, so 20 years ago. That is a staggering realization to make. 20 years ago. And we started dating at the end of January of 2024, which, if anyone is a good sports fan and remembers, was just days before the Eagles played the Patriots in the Super Bowl. The first time. 2004 Super Bowl. So at that time, Meg was serving as a youth volunteer with a local church that was just off campus from where we were studying at Asbury. So she could walk over there and all that. They were having a Super Bowl party. So she asked the youth leaders if she could bring her new boyfriend to come hang out with the youth kids and, be a good example of, a new young Christian relationship. And they said, yeah, sure, that'll be great. First of all, this is a terrible idea for me. To this day, I will not watch games that I care about with youth kids.
And that includes his own kids.
Sometimes. We're watching the game, and that game ended, a very close game. I believe it ended with a field goal made by the Patriots that kind of sealed the thing. Mm-hmm. And I just sat there.
Middle of Kentucky.
Sitting there in deep mourning internally. And she's like, oh, well, that was just a game. I'm like,
oh.
She's like, oh, cool, you got to be a good example. Like, you don't understand. You don't understand. And so that is why our relationship almost ended before it really even began. But we were able to work. I don't remember exactly what that looked like. I think Meg just realized she needed to give me some space.
She's been doing it ever since.
She went and, hung out with the kids in the kitchen or whatever, and I just sat there on the couch for a few more minutes. But, yeah, so that's why Meg's New England Patriots fandom almost...
How long did it take for her to, commit to the Eagles?
It was... So let's see, that was the Super Bowl in 2004. We got married in June of 2006. Mm-hmm. So it was probably that 2005 season that my brother-in-law said something to her, because we were engaged at that point. And so we've never purposefully put on a New England Patriots game.
I was about to say, so what New England team did you convert to as a one-for-one?
I tried to start rooting a little bit for the Red Sox.
Okay.
Help bridge that gap with her family, but they're not really baseball fans anyway.
Okay.
And so, I tried that for, and then 2008 happened with the Phillies, and they were, that core team that went to the Super Bowl,
Yeah, that core baseball team that went to the Super Bowl.
For the record, it is first thing on Monday morning, and here we are. No, they went to the World Series and won in 2008, and that kind of reignited my love for the Phillies, and I said, oh, sorry, Red Sox.
It's bad when I'm correcting you on sports.
Yeah. Facts.
My gosh. Real other, main focus, because we're going through the wilderness and we're going to be discussing trust a lot. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important because we could talk about it every single week of the entire year, and yet we would not, most of us would struggle fully trusting God in all areas of our life and with every decision that we make.
Well, and that's part of it, right? We can feel like we've got this trust with God thing figured out, and then something else happens in some other part of our life, and it's like, ooh, wait, you mean I got to trust God there too?
Yeah. And so what I'm curious about, since we were talking about delayed obedience is disobedience, and talking about how God called them to go conquer the Canaanites earlier, and they didn't because they didn't trust the 2 spies out of the 10. And then they finally try and do it, and Moses didn't go with them, Ark of the Covenant didn't go with them, and they failed horribly. And so I'm curious if there was, whether it be a small instance or a large life decision where you thought you were being faithful to what God was telling you to do from Scripture, and then he just kind of kept closing the doors or making it so it wasn't as successful as you thought.
True confessions time?
Sure.
I don't know that we were supposed to go back to Uganda for our second term.
Ooh.
Why?
Well, after everything that had happened with our car accident towards the end of our first term and where we were emotionally and relationally and all that kind of stuff, mentally, I don't know that it was the right time. And I think there was some other stuff that God wanted to do in us. And so that in between time, we struggled to raise our fundraising stuff to go back as missionaries. Took longer than we anticipated. Got a couple other offers of things we could do, even staying in ministry. But we felt like we had this call to go to Congo, and we were holding so tight onto what we had heard God say at one point that I don't know that we were willing to hear his voice in the midst of that moment. And part of that was that if we didn't, the accident felt even more pointless. Because that was, involved with us exploring opportunities in Congo and a trip to Congo. And if we didn't go back and we didn't keep working towards that, then it really didn't matter. And so I'm not sure that we were supposed to go when we did. And I have spent a good amount of time wondering what could have been if we hadn't, or what heartache could have been spared if we hadn't gone back when we did. If we'd been more willing to hold those plans loosely and walk closely with God in the midst of that uncertainty and that not knowing, and to have listened for his guidance more clearly in the midst of that time.
And it's not that he didn't use that time and it wasn't a fruitful time, but it might have just not been the most fruitful place you could have been compared to being in tune with him.
Yeah, and that second term, there was a lot of really hard stuff. It's one of those woulda, coulda, shoulda, I wonder what if situations. We can't go back. We still have to live with the results of those choices and the consequences of those choices. But I think God has used it in different ways to shape us, and he didn't just give up on us because we chose to go back to Uganda. Jeremy, do you have any stories that kind of fit in with what you're asking me? You're describing about a time when you asked the question.
Yeah.
Got any stories?
Yeah, no, I think going to nursing school, it was very much like people are always going to be dying, so they're always going to need nurses. It's helping people, and it makes good money. So, why wouldn't God want me to help people? Was kind of the mindset. And I already had, a good stomach for the vial. And so, so I just thought, and people kept telling me growing up, too, because I'd, have no problem watching surgery videos or Ripley's Believe It or Not with all the deformities and stuff like that. And because I was good with old people and, went to shut-in ministries and all these kind of things, that's where I think everyone else was pushing me. And I just assumed based off of helping people that it's also what God would want me to do.
But it was kind of more just a pragmatic.
Yeah. So when I got to my junior year, and I'm already doing horrible in school, I was going to a counselor, therapist, whatever, and they also worked with hypnotherapy. And their whole thing is it's not like the movies where you
right.
jingle the
watch back and forth.
Yeah, the watch back and forth, and then I'm a zombie and I do it every once. It was more basically you get an audio file to replay while you're sleeping, and it's supposed to give a little boost to the desires you already have, is how it was described to me.
Okay.
And so if you already yearn for something, this is giving subliminal support to that. And after a few months and almost no benefit in that direction, the guy was maybe you just really don't want to be studying for nursing school. Like, even though, like, you don't want to be seen as a failure, you don't, like, he didn't say this, but, like, this is me. You don't want to be seen as a failure. You don't want to have wasted this money. You don't want to refigure out what your future career is. So, like, those are the factors behind you wanting to study, but you don't actually want to study for these things and like move forward. And so that's kind of where I had the realization of, like, maybe this wasn't supposed to be it. And I don't know what the alternative is, but I don't think this is it. And then even after taking a break, like, I was like, well, I'm already so far in nursing school, and like, it's still like, it took me until, as we talked about before, it's like it took until going to Columbia and relying on God daily for me to have that shift and be like, oh yeah, that's not it at all. I don't need to even bother with any of that. But, you know, God was still able to use that time where all that training helped me take care of my grandfather when I was living, like, his main health at home person for a couple years. Rebecca's a nurse, so I know all the lingo, or most of it. I never made it to senior year. And like, we can share clinical stories, and I've walked with other nursing students in our college programs and stuff like that at church. And the timeline wouldn't have worked out for Rebecca and I to meet in the season that we met if I didn't, spend who knows how many tens of thousands of dollars at nursing school. It was all used for good. I just don't think that maybe is where God would have directed me to go if I had simply asked him and, like, genuinely desired his answer. Yeah. And college and prepping for college and prepping for college is all very challenging and overwhelming. And therefore, trusting in God is really, really important in that. And even just involving him in the decision versus just trying to figure it all out based off of Google recommendations and our friends' recommendations and all that kind of stuff. And the money is definitely a big factor. I mean, when you look at things like, for me, I didn't even consider out of state just because of finances. And so there's definitely limitations, but we don't have a God that has limitations. So I think just going wherever you feel like he's trying to send you. And if you don't feel like he's trying to send you anywhere specific, well, then, then you have your backup options, but trying to include him in that.
Yeah, he has good plans for us, and he wants good things for us. He's not, I don't think God is often trying to send us into terrible, awful situations that are going to be
I'm thinking, what if we shift this to our audience? Because I know most of our high schoolers do not listen to this, though we do have a couple, and I appreciate you guys. That career and retirement. Sometimes I feel like it's well, I've been doing this job for 20, 30 years, and so I'm going to do this now until I retire. But have we ever been open to maybe God's leading you somewhere else? Career shift partway through.
Yeah, or, I mean, here I am as pastor, which was never on the table. But I think even also it's worth people thinking about, what does it look like in our retirement? That's not really a concept we find in Scripture. God never says, all right, you've hit a certain age now, you're done, except for some of the Levites who are responsible for carrying the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah.
They hit a certain point, and he's like, all right, you guys are too old to do this. Like, we're going to get some young bucks in here to carry the...
Heavy to carry.
Yeah. But we might have spent our whole careers working in a certain area, but what's God want to do in us and through us in that next phase of life where we're not tied into a 40 or 50 hour work week and we have more discretionary time to give to him.
Absolutely. And I think twofold of even before you're there of when do you retire?
Sure.
Because walking with people outside of the church, from before of like sometimes the years constantly shift, like you're doing all this math of can I do it now, do I do it later, is this enough to be comfortable, is that enough to be comfortable? But I think including God in that conversation of, and then just trusting that he will provide past that point and potentially open opportunities for other income to come in during retirement. And it's even great for your health. The whole Blue Zones thing on Netflix that talks about like areas that are condensed with a lot of centurions, like people that have lived over 100. A lot of them continue to work. There's a guy who's like 103 years old riding around on a horse, and he only does like 3 hours of work a day, but he's still out and about doing things, and he comes to takes a nap and spends time with the great grandchildren that he has, and and all these things. But it's one of those things of like keeping moving and keeping God in conversation of what this season looks like, and that's what's crazy about like life seasons is it can be a few months, it can be a decade. And so like sometimes we can get comfortable in the ones that are longer and be like, well, I've been doing this for 8 years, so obviously this long term, and we don't even revisit the conversation. It's just, this is what I'm used to, and I like doing what I'm used to. It's just reminded me of a book that I just finished because of my horrible time management skills, called 4,000 Weeks Time Management for Mortals by Oliver Berkman. Side note.
What is the 4,000 weeks?
That is the average lifespan.
Okay.
Currently. And so like if you get it down to weeks, then it's like, oh, it feels more limited somehow. And like we only have so many of these, and how many are we already done? How many do we statistically have left?
Sure.
And I'd highly recommend, if anyone wants to borrow my office, there's a great section about Sabbath and how important Sabbath is, even though this guy isn't religious. But in regards to today's conversation, at the end of it, there's 5 questions he says that we should ask ourselves about the human disease. And the first question is, where in your life or your work are you currently pursuing comfort when what's called for is a little discomfort? And he goes into a small elaboration of like, I'll just read a little bit. The question circumvents the urge to make decisions in the service of alleviating anxiety, and instead helps you make contact with your deeper intentions for your time. If you're trying to decide whether to leave a given job or relationship, say, or to redouble your commitment to it by asking what would make you happiest, is likely to lure you toward the most comfortable option, or else leave you paralyzed by indecision. But you usually know intuitively, especially if you're talking to the Spirit, he didn't write that, whether remaining in a relationship or job would present the kind of challenges that will help you grow as a person, or the kind that will cause your soul to shrivel with every passing week. Choose uncomfortable enlargement over comfortable diminishment wherever you can. And like, there's a lot, like I could redo his last 5 questions and just throw Spirit and God in a few things, and it's very pertinent questions within the faith. And so that's one of those things of like, God can use you for much greater ways because we're walking in his will for our lives, that sometimes the discomfort is what we should be striving for.
Yeah. Which goes against everything in our American culture. Everything in our American culture is focused on what makes me feel most comfortable. What makes me feel, quote unquote, happy. Right.
And that's the battle of this, almost this entire book is, sadly, though I'm reading a second book to make up for it, it's much more of a philosophical approach of time, where it's like, okay, when you make plans, this is your desire at that point, whether it comes to fruition or not.
Sure.
Even though you're going to say, oh, well, next week I will be golfing on this day. Well, if you get in a car accident the day before, you're not going to be golfing that day. Or someone in your family died. Like, all of these things that can shift that. And though we want to try and control time, we only have the now, this moment that we're currently in. And so, as a Christian, are we worrying about the future or what's happened in the past when they're both in God's hand? And so is this moment, but we can directly interact with him now.
Right, that's where he meets us, right?
Him now.
He is I am. He's here in the moment. Grace for the moment.
And so how can we strive to do what he calls us to do now and leave the past to him and the future to him. And I think that is a very tough but also comforting way of moving forward with him. Yeah.
Speaking about being, though, in the moment, as we wrap up this episode, we just this week hit our 3,000 listens. Right, Jeremy?
3001.
All right. We've made it. But Jeremy, tell us what that means.
So we are hosting a giveaway so that by next week we'll have it announced. But before this Sunday, we would like listeners to post on Facebook their favorite episode of the podcast and tag the church in your post, and then we will put all the names together in a wheel and select that as we are recording next week's podcast, and we will be giving away a handful of books to some of the people that participate in that, ranging from Jesus Outside the Lines by Scott Sauls, The Root of the Righteous by A.W. Tozer, The Quest for Holiness, Taken by Surprise, the one about the Asbury Revival last year, and a couple other good ones. And so if you would like the opportunity to win one of those, or also just show support for the podcast, and if it's been a blessing to you that you could share that blessing with some people on social media, utilize the influence that God has given you, that would be great. And we look forward to celebrating a little milestone for the podcast.
Well, that's our conversation for today, but that doesn't mean the conversation is over. We'd love to hear your thoughts on these topics as well. To ask a question about anything we've discussed in this episode, or to join the conversation, you can head over to fumccollingswood.org/podcast. Thanks for being part of this conversation.